Hello, welcome to Stageworthy. I'm Phil Rickaby, the host and producer of this podcast. Stageworthy is Canada's theatre podcast, and on Stageworthy, I talk to theatre makers of all types, from actors to directors to playwrights, producers, stage managers. If they're involved in theatre in Canada, I talk to them. Some of the people I talk to are household names, and the rest are people that I really think you should get to know. Stick around to the end of the episode, and I will tell you about who my guest is next week. But let's jump into this week. My guest this week is Stephen Drover. Stephen is a director and dramaturg. He's currently adapted and is directing Macbeth for Bard on the Beach in Vancouver. So check this out. I love this conversation with Stephen. So here is my conversation with Stephen Drover. Stephen Drover, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you giving me some time. You've adapted and you are directing Macbeth for Bard on the Beach. What? I mean, I might ask like what's tell me about Macbeth. The story is timeless, but tell me about your Macbeth.
Well, it's a tricky play. I directed Macbeth 20 years ago, and I remember feeling the day after it closed, I wanted to do it again because I felt like, I felt like there was more to plumb and more depths to dig through. And so here I am 20 years later with the opportunity to do it again. And it's remarkable the things that I still kind of retain about how I see the play, and also so much has happened in the past 20 years that our perspectives have shifted and our contemporary sensibilities have changed and evolved. So invariably we start thinking about the play differently. And usually when I'm working on a piece of text for which the source material is Shakespeare, and I say that because typically when I'm working on classical text to Shakespeare, it's as an adaptation, as some degree of textual intervention to make the text work for today and to treat Shakespeare as a collaborator rather than a proprietor, I think is a great way to start. And whenever I engage with the text, it's always with a question of like, what is the meaning that's being created at that moment in this theater? Not what kind of meaning do the words inherently have. So I kind of apply I don't know a whole lot about semiotics, but I know a little bit, and I know that there's a difference between what a word was intended to mean and what it actually means as it's being spoken. So I always go, what is the meaning that is being created? And with Macbeth, it gets a bit tricky because then you get into authorial intent or what Shakespeare wanted, and you come across, to use an obvious example, this idea of these witches. As soon as we say witch, we get an idea in our brain. And if we were to look at the text of the source material, what we get is an image of three women with beards kind of singing around a cauldron, throwing in eye of neat, tongue of bat. Like, it kind of sounds like a Halloween sort of image. At least that's what I think of. And I don't think I'm alone. And so I go, is that really what is wanted right now? Or is there some other meaning that's needing to be created in this moment? So a lot of the work of working with Macbeth has been about, I'm tempted to say the word deconstruction, but that sounds a little less disciplined than I had intend to be. But a lot of it is what is the play? How is the play not achieving the things that I think the play wants to achieve? If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. For sure. Years ago, I did a production of the play, and the women who were playing the witches, we wanted to see we know that this is like a fictionalized thing. This is like written to appease King James, who was very much fancied himself a witch hunter and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of fantasy in it. And so we thought, can we sit down with a Wiccan priest and like figure out
Oh,
like
good.
what's
That's
the
great.
reality of
Yeah.
this? And after discussions with the priest, we just came to the conclusion that we within the text of the play, we had to accept it as fantasy. We could not ground it in a
You're
reality
right.
that didn't exist. So
Yeah, that's
it's
great. Yeah.
it's a really fascinating exercise to be like, can we make this? No. Okay, then we just have to accept that this is what it is if we're using these words. It was an interesting exercise.
Yeah, and I applaud you for taking that stance because I think that I mean, I've seen this play many, many times, and the witches have always been I've seen them portrayed as homeless folks, basically. At the time, they were called bag ladies. I've seen them performed as in Robert Lepage's Macbeth last summer as sex workers. And in so many cases, when I see them, I go, I know who that is, and I know what that is, and hence dispels kind of the mystery and the eeriness behind it, because the characters in the play keeps going, what is this? What are these things? We don't have a template for understanding what I'm looking at, and I've been watching a lot of horror movies as inspiration, and the recurring thing is someone being in a position of not knowing what's going on, or like, what is that thing, and what is that noise I'm hearing, and what are these creatures, rather than, oh yeah, it's zombies or whatever. So it's kind of undoing the process of undoing baggage a little bit, cultural baggage and literary knowledge of the play, and kind of seeing if we can steer the play back to some degree of mystery despite its legacy.
Yeah.
Which sounds like very, very lofty, and it doesn't intend to be. It's just about approaching it with questions rather than, we know what this is.
I think that, I mean, one of the problems of presenting the famous plays is that a lot of people who are working on those plays, we know those plays intimately. Like, I've done Macbeth myself 4 times, so I know that play really well. I've
Yeah,
done other plays like 2 times, 3 times. So when you're inside them, you know them really well, and I think you could fall into the tradition of the play or things like that, and
totally.
it can be helpful, I think, to remember, even though we know it, there are going to be audience members for whom this is their first exposure to this play,
Yeah, yeah,
and so the
yeah. And
mystery.
and
Yeah.
and there's audiences like yourself, or like whomever, for whom this is not their first experience. So how do you make it feel fresh, and how do you make it feel like their first experience, so they're able to walk away going, I see the play differently now. Like, ideally, someone who comes to see this Macbeth, what I want them to do is go home and read it, like, right
Right.
away, and go, oh, I'm really interested in the play. I never thought of it this way before. Offering new insight or ideas or questions, or proposing new shapes that might be able to be placed in this container. It's just like every production is an offer to an ongoing conversation, and it's not about getting it right or wrong or doing it justice or any of that, like those ways we talk about making a play like everything's a test. It really is just about, this is something that I think you might like to talk about in the car on the way home, in context of this play that we already know.
I mean, it's one of those things, because Macbeth is one of those, but you don't ideally, you don't leave that play thinking that was nice. You know, there should be a lot of things to talk about. There should be a lot of things to talk about. What what do we do about the leaders with the skeletons in their closet? What do we do with the evil the men do, and there's so many meaty questions in the show. And if somebody leaves and their response was, well, that was a nice night of Shakespeare, that is absolutely what you don't want in the car on the way.
I know. It's ironic, although we feel pressured to provide that to some degree.
Yeah. You mentioned doing the play previously and now coming to it again years later. What were the lessons or the things that you learned in that first production that you really wanted to look at in this one?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I didn't interrogate the supernatural to a degree that deserves to be looked at, and by that I don't mean researching what supernatural means, but just about. I think at the time I just wanted to make a piece of cool theater, And that was kind of the bar. Is it cool? And, I was in my early 30s, and so much of it was, so much of making theater was about making cool stuff. And now I kind of recognize that as aiming for effect rather than entering with some degree of inquiry and going, well, I don't really know, but let's treat the play as a question and see what it is, rather than trying to massage it to fulfill some sort of product-driven vision. And so this time, I suppose, to answer your question, last time I had what I thought was a fleshed out vision, and now I have a healthy inquiry, I suppose, with a hunch that that sometimes works out and sometimes doesn't when it's held up to scrutiny by myself and my colleagues and the other actors. And I go, oh, that doesn't work at all. So I guess I'm much more likely now to toss things out when I go, oh, that doesn't work. It's okay. We'll do something else. As opposed to like, no, this was my vision. And, we're going to like make this silhouette work and and all that stuff,
It is very much like it's an example of how the theater is a collaboration. You can have a vision, but if something isn't working, you kind of have to just let that go.
Yeah. And I always maintain that the work is only as strong as the collaborators in the room. And someone asked me a while ago, what was a book that I could recommend for someone who's learning about directing? And usually someone quotes, something by Peter Brook or Meisner or whatever, like something like that. But my favorite book is a kid's book, a children's book called The King with Seven Friends. It was written in the 60s. And it was just about this king who goes on a quest, but he encounters all these friends, these 7 of them. They all have incredible talents. Like one can turn into a tree and another can become an elephant. And so on the journey, he uses their talents in strategic ways to get the goal. And in the end, someone says, you guys did all the work. How come he gets the prize? And they say, because he led us. Like he knew how to harness the talents that were at his disposal. And he was able to say, well, I'm not actually particularly talented. I did a play a while ago, and it was humbling because I think I'm the least talented person in this room, because I was surrounded by these tremendous artists. And I was like, just saying to myself, don't fuck it up. Just like, don't burn it down. Like me, don't disappoint them. So it really is just kind of, for me anyway, about knowing how to turn those dials or when to say yes and no and let's see and maybe.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah. Or you were mentioning like interrogating the supernatural in Macbeth, and it's not just the witches, and it's not just Hecate. Yeah. It's. I mean, there is a real sense, and it's one of the few plays that I can think of where the idea of the king and the land are one comes into play.
Right.
Because when Macbeth takes the throne, the world goes topsy-turvy. There's like earthquakes and bad weather, and there's all kinds of these terrible things that are happening because the crown sits on the wrong head, and because he is what he is, then everything else goes bad too. And it's I don't know offhand of another one of the plays that interrogates or like even speaks to the idea of the king and the land are one as part of its supernatural take.
The only other I can think of 2 not exact examples, but Hamlet does it a bit when so many of these plays have the same cycle. They all begin with the death of a monarch and end with the restoration of a monarch. It's about the king is dead, long live the king, especially with the history plays. And going with the idea that an Elizabethan hero is one who restores balance to the world, whereas like a romantic hero, for instance, is someone who changes the world for the better. That if we look at something like Hamlet, the world is thrown into array when the rightful king is murdered, and then when he tells his son to avenge his death. And so there's recurring images of like something's rotten in Denmark, state of garbage. So that's not land particularly, but it is talking about Denmark. It is, and the kings and nobles being referred to by name in terms of the land that they are in charge of, which I find very interesting. In Macbeth, there's the Thane of Ross. We don't know what his real name is, but he's the guy who's in charge of Ross, or in charge, Thane of Fife, whatever. And the only example I can think of is Richard III, where the but that's not land-based, that's kingdom-based. That's the ethos of the population that kind of falls into some degree of disrepair. But you're right, there is something in Macbeth about, the night that Duncan's murdered, there's a reference of like, I dreamt that, chimneys were knocked down and shrieks in the air. I've never seen anything like it. And the earth reacts in response to this upset in the great chain of being. And so nothing can restore balance until the rightful heir is back on the throne. We're kind of taking that into our production a little bit by like kind of leaning a little bit into, well, not a little bit into, but really leaning into a post-environmental environment. So it's very dystopian. It's placed at a time after something terrible has happened to the earth. The outside is inhospitable, the air is poison, whatever, which we don't get into specifics about naming. I don't think that's as important as the fact that the earth is rotten or barren or wasted, and the one person who can maybe get us back on track is Duncan, and he's murdered. So what do we do now? So I've taken that as inspiration into the production. But yeah, you're right. There is something very connected about the land and the earth when it comes to this play. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier about Shakespeare as a collaborator. Could you talk a little bit about what that means to you?
I think, I'm not I don't practice bardolatry. I love Shakespeare's text. I love I love this work, but I also recognize that it was very, very, very timely. I don't support the idea that part of me always bristles a little bit whenever we talk about the work as being timeless, because it was of a time. Shakespeare didn't write it for all time, despite what the editors of the First Folio say in their introduction. But he was responding to things that were going on in front of him. And I think, I have no proof of this, but I suspect, given the early modern, how much they loved adaptation and how they would interpret one another's work, that the crowning skill or talent was for imitation. You're judged not on how generative you were being able to create stories, but in how you could interpret other people's works. This is why I always kind of go, we talk about the original, that Shakespeare's plays are not the original. Like, he based it on an adaptation, and that was based on an adaptation. They didn't really use the word adaptation because it was just the way they did things. But I tend to think that if Shakespeare were around today and he was in the room while we were rehearsing, he would say, "Oh, don't say that. Like that's a reference to something thousands of miles away, hundreds of years ago. No one knows what it is. Let's adapt it, and let's get the people today to look at themselves and not look at some ancient civilization." So I take that as inspiration to go, how can we treat the text not necessarily as raw material, but as the contribution of an absent collaborator. Years ago, I attended a conference in Louis Doucet, who was the artistic director of Play on Shakespeare in Oregon. I attended a roundtable discussion she was in, and she said that it was so simple. She said Shakespeare is more than just the words, and that kind of changed my perspective quite a bit, because it's true. Like, if Shakespeare is translated into French or German or any other language, like, we don't say, well, that's not Shakespeare because it's not the poetry, but we keep saying Shakespeare is the words. And I'm interested also in Shakespeare the story, or Shakespeare the mythology that's generated, or the permissible containers that it presents into which we can pour ourselves and see our own stuff, in addition to the stuff that happened a long time ago. So we're in some degrees in communication with an ongoing conversation. So taking all that into my heart, I embrace the idea of Shakespeare not as someone whom we serve, but someone who's at the table with us while we build, and to go, with the best of intentions, what do we think would the playwright do in the room? And in some cases, let's cut it up and move it around. Let's not worry too much about iambic pentameter, because it doesn't. You know who doesn't care about iambic pentameter is audiences. That's my joke. But and I have to go toe to toe sometimes with actors who get upset when I break the meter. But it helps them learn lines. But I think there's value in massaging things and to create meaning that might hint at what the original audience of the work could have experienced.
Yeah.
That's a long-winded way of answering.
Oh,
your
I love it.
question.
I love it. Thank you. Now, you are the adapter of this play as well as the
Yeah.
director. In that kind of situation, when you're doing both, is there a way that you manage the conversation with yourself as the director and the adapter?
That's a good question. To some degree, it sometimes requires outside eyes to come in and go, did I get this right? Because I mean, most of the time I'm working with playwrights as the dramaturg. And my job is to not really have a creative horse in the race, like to stand outside it so I can say what it's doing and name it without getting too close to it. Because I know as a director, like, the night before opening, someone will say to me, how's the show? Is it going well? And I'll say, I don't know. We'll see. Like, I have no idea. I think it's working, how often do you go to see something and you're able to name what's happening to it after one viewing, where someone's been working with it for months isn't able to see it because you just get too close. So I try to take that lesson into an adaptation process where I kind of need eyes to come in and go, you got this wrong, or, kind of behave a little bit like a playwright and say, hey, what do you see? And how can we adjust that so it's creating the meaning that we want to create? So that's part of it. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Now, you are somebody who wears several hats in your creative life. You are a director, a dramaturg, you're a new play developer, a teacher, researcher. In your mind, how do those titles, those hyphenates, relate to each other? And does each one feed the other for you, or are they separate lives?
They all kind of feel like the same job, man. Like sometimes it's like I always avoid hyphenates because like I just go, to make it easy, I'll say I'm a director because most of the time people don't know what a dramaturg is. And if you say scholar, they think you're a professor perhaps. But for me, it's all kind of extensions of the same thing. I directed for a long time before I started thinking about dramaturgical processes about, 5 years ago in any kind of substantial way. And since doing so and going back to school for it, it's changed my perspective tremendously on creative process and interpretive process, more importantly. But it all kind of feels like just extensions of being curious and asking questions and saying, well, maybe, or let's see what this is. And I kind of hang on to that right up until, I don't know, opening night. Let's see what it is. I don't actually know what it is yet. And again, I take inspiration from playwrights who are able to play the long game with a single play over many years and are able to see it change and to constantly think that they're at a place where they go, I know what this play is, but they're constantly surprised. This old saying that a play is never finished, just abandoned. And just to give it a chance to surprise you. And I worked with Amy Lee Lavoie and Omari Newton many times, regular collaborators, but we made a play a few years ago called Redbone Coonhound, and it premiered here in Vancouver, and then it went to Toronto, and then it went to Montreal. And at the end of the Montreal run, they said, now we think we know what this is now. After 3 productions, that's when they said, I think we can get this published or whatever. And even now they, because they changed, their perspectives changed, their ideas of the play changes. So these are labels that you mentioned are just different ways of saying curiosity, I think, and to absolve oneself from having answers. But I read this wonderful thing when I was a student, is that a director's job is not to provide answers, but to generate interest. And that's a really wonderful leading value, I think, that I bring into a rehearsal room or a process with a playwright or working with a student or writing an article or a paper, which I also like doing. It's a different kind of collaboration, but it's based in asking questions and offering up, saying, what do you think? And contributing to a conversation.
Right. Right. You
Yeah.
mentioned, you were a director and you sort of came to dramaturgy.
Yeah.
What sparked your interest in dramaturgy as a practice?
The kind of a recurring gesture throughout my my life with theater has been kind of a series of concentric rings. I started rather irresponsibly as an actor because I just kind of wanted to hang out with my friends who were already in the theater program. So I didn't enter with a great deal of like, I am born to be an actor. I just kind of want, or like, this looks fun. But then I found after time, I had trouble just focusing on the role, and I was asking questions of the play. And I remember a professor said, "You're thinking a bit like a director." So I wanted to step back and see the play. And so that was great. But after a while, I kind of wanted to step back and see the play in context of a larger collection of plays, which is, like producing a season. So I was starting to think like an artistic director. And so I did that for a while and started thinking about big picture, assembling a variety of experiences and projects for folks. And then I found myself stepping back even further and going, well, what is a play? How does a play work, and structurally, how does narrative create meaning in our imaginations, and what is it about storytelling that makes us feel like we're somehow in conversation or communion with those who came before us. And so that's, for me, that's where dramaturgy comes in, is what are recurring patterns and motifs over time that we apply to different narratives, and how can we take control, not take control of those, but how can we be aware of them as we're creating new work to help generate the kind of experiences that we found inspiring to make us come to the theater to begin with. So that's a long-winded way of saying it's been a process of stepping back and back and back and back and looking at big pictures. And so dramaturgy for me is the biggest picture.
Now, I throw the word around, but not everybody who listens to this podcast is aware of what a dramaturg is, what dramaturgy is. Just
Yeah.
from a certain reality, how would you describe what a dramaturg is to somebody who had no idea what it is?
No, that's fair. And that's a question with a variety of answers, and it can be unique to whichever dramaturg you're speaking with. For me, a dramaturg is my job is to see it and to name it, and to see patterns between the story that we're working with and the reference points that we're taking from other places. Operating under this idea that the way we create meaning is by pulling in experiences and stories from many, many different places. That's just like, that's just like Richard III, or that's just like Death of a Salesman, or that's just like Terminator, or whatever. Like all these basic narratives, and how we create meaning in them. So it's my job is to both work with a playwright to kind of see what they're doing. Like, and my favorite metaphor is like, if the playwright is the painter and they're making a painting, but they're on a mural, they're making a mural, and they're up on the scaffold and they're getting up very, very detailed, and they're making small changes to the mural, but they're up on the scaffold, they're too close, they can't see it. But the dramaturg is the one on the ground who's able to tell them what they're doing. Like, just, this is what I see. Not this is what you should do, but this is what I see, and this is what it's called. So consequently, for me, a good dramaturg is a very good basis in theory and a variety of modalities and frameworks, and understands literary and theater history, and is able to understand how the project that we're working on walks in a legacy, and what that legacy is, and how things change when you're, if you're working on a show and halfway through the show you realize, oh, this is a comedy. It changes the way that you build it. Or if you go, oh my God, there's nestled within this comedy is a murder mystery. And so then we go, okay, how does murder mystery work? And how do we turn those corners, or apply those fundamental shapes that can help us understand it? Now, this isn't about finding the right box to put things in, but it is about finding naming the echoes that comes with a play. that's a long-winded philosophical way of talking about what dramaturgy is, or what a dramaturg does. I mean, really, anybody working on a play is doing dramaturgy. They're building a play. I mean, dramaturgy is the study of the composition of a drama. How is it composed? So a dramaturg is a specialist in play composition, effectively. But I will note that for me anyway, as a dramaturg, I'm not a creative artist. I'm an interpretive one. I'm not generative. I don't make things. I interpret and have a conversation about it, if that makes sense.
It makes absolutely perfect sense. I am curious if, as somebody who was, went from the actor to somebody said you're more of a director. At that point, did you know what a dramaturg was? And do you think that if you'd been introduced to that's where your instinct already was going?
No, I don't think I would have at the time. It took me some time to come around to this. I think I needed to sit in that concentric ring before I was able to step out and realize, oh, there's one more step back I could go. And I think that, and this is probably apropos your original question about what's different now in this production of Macbeth than originally. And as a young director, I kind of bought into the idea of the director as the visionary, the person who sees everything. And the proof is in the pudding, because I was wrong. I didn't. And the play didn't work in a variety of ways. And I think because I was probably carrying too much weight. And, the theater's done a very good job, or done an interesting job anyway, of portioning out responsibilities over time. 100 and whatever years ago, there was no director. We didn't have that. That's a job we created because we believed that would fulfill a need. Same with stage manager. Same with an intimacy director or intimacy coordinator, which is a job that's like barely 10 years old. And now it's, if I do a play, I get a budget line item that says intimacy director, without even going, is there any intimacy in this play that nobody holds hands, nobody kisses, but it becomes a standard go-to that this is a job in the theater that we recognize. And I think for a long time I was doing dramaturgical work as a director, but when you're doing too many jobs at once, and I'm sure you know that, it's fine to be the director, lead actor, producer, and writer, but eventually you're going to put one of those balls down so you can focus on something else. So when I became a director, I never considered dramaturgy as anything viable. And I think if you presented it to me, I wouldn't have understood what it was. And so I think I had to sit in that concentric circle for a little bit longer and fail a bunch, which I did, to go, okay, maybe I can take a step back and take myself out of the creative equation a little bit, and so I can name what the equation is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you mentioned failure, and I think that's the great teacher in any role. How important do you think failure is for the playwright as they're creating their play, to not quite make the jump, to not quite get to where they think they need to go? Are those experiences important in the creation of the play?
Yeah, and I think it's, as a dramaturg, I try to do what I can to provide them with opportunities to see those failures or see those mistakes. For me, that's quite often when a playwright hears a play being read in front of an audience, then they hear it differently and they go, okay, that's what I've written. And they can go, oh, that doesn't work. And we can go back to the drawing board a little bit. I reject this idea, and I think we do anyway, this idea of a playwright sitting alone in a garret up in the, and emerging with this finished thing. It doesn't work that way. It's incredibly collaborative. And it was with Shakespeare as well. Just to throw out the authorial thing, to whom is this work attributed? It's invariably a broad list of people who in some capacity contributed to the collection of ideas that make up a play. And I think that the more a playwright can have access to at least the opportunities to see how it's not working. I have yet to meet a playwright who has not been thankful for those opportunities. I mean, it's hard. It's really hard to get notes and to be attached to something and for someone to go, you know what, it doesn't work. And I experience it. I'm directing this show now, and then the artistic director will show up and watch her run, and he'll go, yeah, I don't understand. This doesn't make any sense. And I go, oh my God, I thought it was brilliant. Okay, all right. And then you process it, and the day later you go, you know what, he's right, and I can make it better. rather than trying to make it fit what I need it to fit. So I think, one of my favorite quotes is from Samuel Beckett, and he said, "Do it again, fail better." And I really love that. And I think that it's really wonderful that we have such a gift in new play development processes to put the play in front of an audience before we have to put the play in front of an audience, sometimes more than once. And that audiences, like a good audience, understands process, and they're able to go, okay, this is not a finished product, and the actors are at music stands or whatever, and that everything's a test kitchen, even a first production of a show.
Yeah.
It's never finished.
Well, it's so informative as a playwright. Even just sitting around a kitchen table and hearing the play read out loud teaches so much. Even just as a cold read, oh, this does not roll off the tongue the way that I thought it did, or this is clunky. Like so much becomes clear. And then to have actors take the time to like dig into it and like explore it, and then hear an actual audience react to it. The audience will always tell you the truth.
Yeah.
Not on the
I know,
talk back
it's so
necessarily
funny.
if you do a talk back, but they will always tell you the truth in how they react to a play. And there's so much that a playwright can learn just from being in the room for that.
Yeah, and also they're able to go, this is who's going to be listening, because there's no such thing as a universal audience. A play that works here might not work in Medicine Hat. I don't know, like, and it's true. Like, we do a show here and it doesn't work, and we bring it to Toronto and they love it, or vice versa, because we bring different experiences to understanding the play. So it's not just about what the play is, it's about what is the interaction that the play is going to be a part of, and how do we need to be mindful of that.
Yeah. I've seen that so many times on the Fringe circuit, where somebody will like premiere a show at the Montreal Fringe Festival,
Right?
and it kills, and then they take it to Toronto and nobody likes it, and then they take it to Winnipeg, and it's kind of, it's like each city reacts differently to each show, and it's important to just understand that each city's sensibility is different, and how they react to things is different. You mentioned Redbone Coonhound. I spoke to the authors a couple years ago when it was about to premiere in Toronto. And I'm curious because, I only saw it in Toronto, and I know how the audience in Toronto reacted to it. But I'm curious if like what were there differences in the way that the audiences reacted to that show and what they took from that show as it moved across Canada?
Yeah, I didn't see the Montreal production. I went to Toronto to see the opening there. So I got to see it here in Vancouver and again in Toronto, with their very, very different experiences. I mean, it was part of a rolling world premiere, so those were two different productions with different casts, different directors, but if this effectively the same script. And the big, because for anyone who doesn't know, that this is a play that interrogates racial microaggressions, and so being played in Vancouver, where there's a very small Black population. There's not many Black folks in Vancouver. I don't know the numbers, but it's quite small, versus going to Toronto, where it's a different story. Like in Vancouver, there would be an average audience, and maybe there'd be like 2 maybe Black people in the audience, and invariably, because it's a funny play, the Black folks are laughing, and the white folks want to laugh, and they're kind of like checking in with the Black folks. Are we allowed to laugh at this? Kind of, like, is this all right? But then we go to Toronto, and everybody felt, oh, this is, it had a different sense of caution, or less of it anyway, in Toronto than it did here. And you know what? It might be different with different shapes. Like a play that falls in Toronto might be received here differently because people understand it better or differently. So it was remarkable to see how those two audiences in those two towns recognized themselves in the play in different ways.
Yeah.
Or didn't.
Yeah. One of the hats that you wear is the head of new works at the Arts Club, which is the largest urban theater company in Canada. What does the new play development pipeline look like, and how do you think about what kind of plays get your attention for development, or what makes you think of something as something that you want to see developed more?
No, that's a good question. Like, our new play development program is geared almost exclusively to developing the works that we commission. So it's not, folks will occasionally sometimes approach us with an idea for a script or a script that's like part written or fully written. They say, we'd like to, would you develop this for us? And I have to explain that it doesn't work that way. You don't bring the script to us and we develop it for you and send you on your way. For the most part, we'll commission new scripts, and then, the bulk of the efforts are about developing those new scripts. So to answer your question, it depends on what is the entry point for the project. In some cases, it'll be, we're interested in this story. So for instance, Ashley Corcoran, who's the artistic director, who took over as AD basically the same year that I came on as head of new works. She was keen for a long time on a new feminist adaptation of Cyrano de Bergerac. So she had that in our brain, and I was like, you say adaptation, you're speaking my language. So we were kind of like having that on the back burner, looking for how to do that. And we said, I think this is about inviting a playwright to write that adaptation for us. So we approached Christine Quintana, and she wrote a play called Someone Like You. And in terms of Redbone Coonhound, it was Amy and Omari who came to us and then said, we got this script, is this of interest to you? And they just had a treatment at the time, like 2 or 3 scenes. And we said, yeah, this looks great. Let's commission this. And in some cases, we've had playwrights, we had a playwright's agent come to us and say, would you like to commission this playwright to write this thing? And, so there's different ways of getting to a commission, but we try our best to treat the process as like one size fits one, because some playwrights write really fast and some take a very long time. And we try to go as best we can to go, that's fine. Like, what do you need? And here are some poles around which we can pivot the process. We can say, we can do a stage reading here if you want. If it's someone who doesn't live in Vancouver, we can say, we'll bring you into town on this date. If you want to aim for a draft for then, great. If not, then we can figure something else. So it's a lot of process design a little bit, with the goal of eventually getting to the place of producing it on the stage. That's always the goal. It's not always the case, because things change, and sometimes playwrights end up writing plays that, they get part way and they go, I don't want to write this play anymore. I want to write something else. And we have things in place to say, okay, let's do that. Or, you know what, that's not what we wanted, so let's part ways or whatever. But it's always with the intention of producing. So we try to develop with the support in mind that will allow them to succeed on one of our stages, so that they're not writing a play for someone's living room, for instance, or they're not writing a play for, the Royal Albert Hall or whatever. So they try to present those frameworks as a way to articulate goals.
Yeah. I am curious, because I know that you grew up in Newfoundland and you've ended up in Vancouver. So what is the trajectory that took you from Newfoundland to Vancouver and led you to where you are now?
Well, I after doing a bachelor's degree in theater in Vancouver, I at that point I had a professor who was the first person to say, you might have some directing sensibilities in you, which I don't think was him saying, I think you're talented. I think it was just like, you're not in the play when I'm trying to direct you. Like, your brain is somewhere else. So it was a half a backhanded comment, but also a challenge. And his name was Ken Livingston. He's unfortunately passed away, but he was the first graduate of the MFA program at UBC way back, like in the 60s, I think. And I knew that I wanted to do a master's degree in directing. And I looked at the small sampling of universities across Canada that offered it. And at the time, he put UBC in my brain. And then when I looked into it, I discovered that a professor here, Neil Freeman, who also sadly has passed, was doing a lot of interesting work with Shakespeare text. And I read Neil's books, and I got really into his approach. So largely I came here for that, and Neil and I became friends. He became my mentor. And then when it was all done, you spend 2 years doing some graduate work in a community. You get to know the community a little bit, and you kind of make some connections. So I just kind of ended up staying around, like kind of Vancouver kind of chose me. It wasn't like when I was done, I'm like, okay, where do I go now? thought, well, I've already got some things lined up, so I'll just stay. And that was, 25 years ago now. So I just kind of found my way here without, also, part of me, the stubborn Newfoundlander, was like, well, if I'm going to leave, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go far away. If I'm going to stay in Canada, I suppose I could have gone to Victoria, gone a little bit further, but yeah, so that was part of it as well.
What was your introduction to theater? What was it that made you want to pursue that?
Well, like I said earlier, when I finished high school, I entered university with the original intention of going into medicine, and I was doing a lot of sciences. I was doing, chemistry and biology and physics and advanced mathematics and all this stuff. And it was fine. I really liked that. And I have a bit of an empirical brain, so it kind of appealed to that. But I also have part of my brain's also got a bit of a less or a more amorphous shape to it. And my best friend at the time decided a long time ago that he wanted to go into theater. And so that's what he did. And he would harass me and say, why don't you come and do this here? You'd be great. I don't know what he was basing that on, because I had no history being any kind of artist, and there's no artist in my family. And so I think on a moment of weakness, it got me very drunk. And I kind of, my decision to enter theater into my life started with the prophetic words of fuck it. That's the truth. So I started for very irresponsible and selfish reasons, but that's how I started. But I think there was no thunderbolt. There was no single moment where I went, oh my God, this is amazing. Or, there wasn't a production that I saw that changed my life or anything like that. It was much more of a very, very slow burn where I just kind of woke up one day and realized, well, I'm doing this thing. It wasn't like I'm going to decide. There was no decision. I wish there was. It would make a good story, but it was kind of like, and I used this metaphor a while ago in another conversation. It was like falling in love, where you just kind of like, some people are hit by Cupid's arrow or whatever, and some people it's a long burn. You fall in love over a long time, and that's what it was like for me. I just kind of end up here somehow, and I didn't fight it.
Yeah. Now you have a neurodivergent brain. How does your neurodivergence inform the work that you do?
Yeah, I have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. And so, in the neurodivergent community, that we would call that ADHD, and that's not a standalone condition, but it more is a shorthand for representing the overlap between those two neurological profiles and what happens in that. If you think about autism and ADHD in a Venn diagram and the overlap and what happens in that place. And I was diagnosed late in life, so it's something I'm still getting to know, how my brain behaves and how it thinks and what it needs. But since understanding this profile that I've had apparently my whole life, but only recently been named, a lot of things are becoming clear for me. Like, for instance, I know that my autistic brain craves repetition, it craves scheduling, it craves structure, it craves regularity. My ADHD brain craves novelty, it craves adventure, it craves chaos to some degree. And so I found that theater's ironically the ideal place for that overlap, because, for instance, there's always a new show. You spend 2 months on a show and then there's something new, but that something new has, like, we rehearse 10 to 6 and here's the production schedule and here's the cue sheet, and it's very structured. But within that structure, there's room for free forming a little bit. So for me, it appeals to the need for structure, but also the need for freedom. And Shakespeare particularly does that because it's so, you talk about, if there's any kind of writing that has math attached to it, not just iambic pentameter, but also like the 5-act structure, which we find in every scene, every speech, almost sometimes every line, or like the rule of threes, or like all these, like, I'm not a numerologist, but I do find the recognizing pattern in work very satisfying. So that's kind of my autism brain. But then the ADHD brain says, this is the shape of that container, and we can fill it with a variety of things. One of my favorite scholars, Emma Smith, says Shakespeare's greatest talent is his sheer permissive gappiness, that he includes these things in the play that dots that don't connect, and he invites us to fill ourselves into those gaps. And I find that very satisfying, but I know that those gaps are defined by clear outside walls. So that's a long-winded way of saying that the combination of structure and freedom really kind of, I think anyway, appeals to the kind of brain that I was born with.
Yeah.
And it's proven to be, the one area of my life that I don't have to talk to my therapist about. Right. I go, when it comes to work, I'm all good. I'm good. It's like everything else, I need some help with, but.
Just as we draw to a close, I want to
Sure.
return to Macbeth just for 1 second. And I'm curious about, is there something that you have learned about the play in rehearsal that was unexpected for you?
Oh, that's a good question. There's something about the play that I've learned in rehearsal that was unexpected. And there's so many different little things. Every day I go, I come home and I say to my wife, "Oh, this fucking play. Like, you've done this, you know this. Why are you so surprised?" So you think you have a play's number, and then you work on it and you go, God, it's just elusive. And it's just it really does mess with your mind in a way that is consistently surprising, because I think again, if we embrace this idea of it being a permissive container and allowing ourselves to find ourselves in it rather than try to become what it needs us to become, that you'll invariably in the process see parts of yourself that you didn't know were there, maybe. And you go, oh, I didn't know that I found that thing about life upsetting, or there's a big thing in Macbeth about the child that they once had, and the child is died, and which is a big question mark in the play, is like, how does grief play into their motivation? And he even says stories, bring forth men, children only. So ostensibly they could have more children. So I find that the presence of children in a narrative that's so bleak and kind of horrible and violent, a friction that triggers me in a way that I didn't expect to. Now, since directing it 20 years ago, now I've had 2 children, so that's part of it as well. I go, oh, I didn't think that doing this play that I know so well would trigger sensitivities about kids. So that's something that I've found interesting, and not something to shy away from, but just to clock that that there's how we receive information changes because we change.
Yeah. I mean, there are kids in Macbeth and they don't fare so well. So it's not, it's definitely something that, like, not only have Macbeth and his wife lost a child, but there are other kids that don't have a great ending in this show. Somebody else loses their children. It's actually it can be a theme of the play.
It is, yeah, no, totally. I totally agree with you that it is a recurring thing, and we're built to think that the same thing's going to happen to Fleance, who manages to escape, and play drops that thread and doesn't pick it up later, and we go, oh, that kid's still out there somewhere, which is another thing about the play that we don't need him anymore, so he's gone. But there's a scene where Macduff's wife and children are killed or slaughtered, and I thought, I don't want to see that on stage. I don't think it's going to help the narrative. I think we'd have a hard time getting folks back to the story after doing any kind of representation of that. So I said to the sound designer, MJ Coomer, who's a frequent collaborator, I said, can you create a soundscape of a woman and her children being, murdered and butchered? And MJ said, okay. And they went away and came back with something and played it for me, and said, that's perfect. I don't ever want to hear it again. Or at least, like, let's wait till cue to cue. But I don't think we need to fine tune it, because it's doing the job, which is that's another surprising thing too, that I'm surprised, because I knew this, because the play is full of murder. It's full of terrible, terrible, terrible things. And I've been reminded how we whitewash that in the theater and kind of like make it sanitized, and that the fights are driven by honor and nobility and are clean, and I run you through, sir, and the sword goes under my arm, and I have a noble death, and it's very clean. But that's not the play. The play is incredibly brutal and inelegant and messy and very bloody. I'm bringing lots of blood into this production, like physical, like lots of sticky blood, which makes me very unpopular with the stage crew, but I hope everyone else likes it. But you eventually go, well, that's the play. Why are we doing this play if we're not going to do the play? Like if you're going to do Titus Andronicus, you got to own some stuff. You got to go, well, this is where we're going, or don't do it.
Yeah.
Or find ways for the audience to receive it in a way that is going to be meaningful, and not just affirmative and say, yes, everything you know about Macbeth is correct, and this production will affirm it. And you can go home and feel good about, what you already knew. So it challenged me a little bit, and I hope that folks go, oh, wow, that's something else. Or at least not that's something else, but the play is something else.
I mean, it is definitely, I mean, I find it difficult to think of the play as anything other than like everyone's anger, hatred, and revenge coming together, because that's when people are, especially near the end, they're fighting for things that happened, especially Macduff. They're fighting for their own revenges and avenges, and it becomes very personal. And
yes,
that is very bloody in this play.
Yeah, and I often think about Richard III. Another show that I've directed was a wonderful, wonderful play. But at the end of that, the hero that emerges, ostensibly Richmond, this like plug and play hero, another one that Shakespeare doesn't allow us to get to know, and he kind of comes in and saves the day and then steps away. He's doing it for the country and for England and for the for the monarchy, whatever. Macduff's just doing it because Macbeth killed his family.
Yeah.
I mean, it originally is like, this is for Scotland, but it turns into a revenge story.
Yeah.
And that's a cold-blooded place to come from. So trying to honor that without being too like iconoclastic about it, without being gratuitous, and without just doing gore for the sake of doing gore. Like I did that in my 20s. So it's about what's the line that fulfills what the play's asking us to do, and being honest about that.
Well, Stephen Drover, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you giving me some time and talking about Macbeth and so many other things. Thanks for joining me on the program.
Oh, my pleasure. Anytime. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Stageworthy. I really appreciate you listening this far. If you're watching on YouTube, please make sure that you hit the like button, leave a comment so that I know that you were here, and hit the subscribe button and that bell icon so that whenever I put out a new episode, you'll get notified that a new episode is available. If you're listening to the audio version, make sure that you are subscribed. Go to your favorite podcast app, search for Stageworthy, and hit the follow button. And while you're there, if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please make sure to leave a rating and a review. Your ratings and reviews really do help. They push the podcast up in the algorithm so that more people will be able to find it. I would be super grateful if you could do that. And speaking of gratitude, let me talk about my Patreon. I can't do this show without the people who've chosen to back me on Patreon. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll see their names on the screen now. A podcast like this is put out for free for the listener, but it does cost money to make. It costs money to have a website. It costs money to do editing software. It costs money to have transcripts, the hosting platform so that the podcast can be distributed to all of the podcast listening places. That costs money too. All of these things add up. And if not for my patrons, I would not be able to do this. Stageworthy has been in existence for 10 years, and for 9 of those years, I paid for everything out of pocket. And I know the cost of living has gotten higher for everyone, but it was becoming untenable for me. And thankfully, my patrons were able to step up and help me to cover the cost of creating this show. And I love doing this show. And I am so grateful to my patrons for helping me to make this podcast. If you would like to help me to make this podcast, if you enjoy this podcast and you want to be part of it, please consider becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/stageworthy and join up. Patrons get early access to episodes. We'll have conversations about interesting things about Canadian theater. And the more people who join the Patreon, the more I will be able to offer to my patrons. So please join. Go to patreon.com/stageworthy and become a patron. My guest next week is Taylor Trowbridge. Taylor is the playwright and performer behind the fringe show Dads. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about dads. She's going to ask me a couple of questions about my dad because her show is about dads. And just generally, we're going to learn about that show. And I really think it's going to be an exciting one at the Toronto Fringe Festival this year. So tune in next week for my conversation with Taylor Trowbridge.